Welcome to Wheelock's Latin Chapter 32. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at adverbs, both the formation and comparison of adverbs. We'll be looking at three new irregular verbs, Wolo, Nōlō, and Mālō, and we'll be looking at a new usage of subjunctive, the Proviso Clauses. Let's jump into our adverbs first. Now, if you remember from your English grammar days, adverbs are words that describe verbs, nouns, or other adverbs, and usually precede in Latin the word that they modify. Now, in Latin, there are two different kinds of adverbs. There are those adverbs that have a unique form unto themselves. You've learned many of them already: semper, saepe, ita, tam, sic, cur, etiam, etc. Then there's the adverbs that are actually derived from adjectives. And within this category, there are two subcategories. There are those that are derived from first and second declension adjectives, like longus aum. And then there's adverbs that are derived from third declension adjectives, like fortis, forte. Now, let's take a look on how we form these adverbs, and then we'll also look at the comparison of adverbs. All right, so to form an adverb from a first or second declension adjective, you're just going to take the base of that adjective and add an E, a long E specifically. We'll look at examples of these in just a minute. So that's pretty simple, base plus ending. Now for third declension adjectives, we're going to take the base and add ter, T-E-R. Or if it's a third declension adjective that the base ends in an NT compound, then we're going to add an ER instead of ter. It wouldn't do well to have NT-T-E-R, so those two T's just coalesce and you end up with NT and then add the ER. All right, so either an E for first and second declension adjectives, or for third, it's either going to be ter or depending on what the base is. All right, let's take a look at a couple of examples here. Here is the first and second declension adjective longus aum, which means long. And to make this an adverb, we're going to take the base long and add an E, a long E. And that forms longue. And this word as an adverb means far. Now, if you remember in your English, by the way, let me take a break here real quick and remind you that many times adverbs in English end in an ly, but not always. You'll see in this next example, this is the adjective liber, libera, liberum, meaning free. We're going to take the base, liber, and add the long E, so that gives us libere, and that word means freely. We take the adjectival definition free and simply add an ly to it, freely. Now, keep in mind, this is an interesting example because it is first and second declension adjective that ends in ER. Make sure you compare that with this first or second declension adjective that ends in ER, pulcher, pulchra, pulchrum, meaning beautiful. If you remember, the feminine loses the E that you see in the masculine form. Pulcher becomes pulchra, and that's carried over into the neuter, pulchrum. So it's that stem, pulchra, with P-U-L-C-H-R. To that, we're going to add the stem, or the ending E, and so we end up with pulchre, meaning beautifully. All right, now what about third declension? Well, here we have the third declension adjective, fortis, forte. Masculine and feminine is fortis, the neuter is forte, and it means brave. Now we're going to take the stem, fort, and remember, because this is third declension, we add iter, so it's fort iter, fortiter, and this word means bravely. Here's another third declension adjective. This one happens to end in an ER, celer, celeris, celere, meaning quick. And here, again, the base or stem is celer, and we're going to add the iter to it. And so we end up with celeriter, quickly. All right, now, here's another third declension adjective that ends in ER. This one has a masculine, feminine, neuter form, acer, acris, acre. Again, the E has dropped out of the masculine, leaving the stem acr that you see in the feminine and the neuter. This means fierce. So we take that stem, acr, and to that we add iter, and we end up with acriter, meaning fiercely. We've got one more example here. This is a third declension adjective that ends, the stem ends in nt, sapiens, and then the genitive, of course, is where you see the stem fully, sapientis. So sapiens, this is one of those third declension adjectives that the masculine, feminine, and neuter form are all the same, sapiens. But in the genitive, you see the stem, sapient. Drop that is, genitive, singular ending, so you see the base, sapient. This means wise. So because it ends in nt instead of iter, we're going to add So we end up with sapienter, meaning wisely. So that's how you form the the adverbs. It's pretty simple. Take the first or second declension base and add a long E, or if it's a third declension, we're going to add an iter, or if the stem ends in an nt, we add Now, just like adjectives, adverbs can also have a comparative and a superlative form. So there are different degrees of comparison for adverbs. So just as a quick reminder, here's how we form the positive form of adverbs for first or second declension. We add an E to a base. Even for first and second declension adjectives that end in ER, it's still just an E. And for third declension, it's going to be iter that we add to the base, or if that base ends in an NT, we're adding Now, how about comparison? Well, we're going to add to the base IUS, regardless of whatever declension it is, IUS. And what's interesting is that if you remember, this is actually from our adjective comparative. This is the neuter comparative ending. We'll show you an example of that here in just a minute, but it's the exact same form. Superlative. If you remember, we added isimus aum to adjectives to make them superlative. Well, here we're going to add isim We've already set the precedent for adding a long E. Well, we're adding that long E to the isim ending, not an isimus. We drop that usaum. It's just isim And that is for all of the various superlative forms of all the different adjectives, with the exception, if you'll remember, that for superlative we had special ending for adjectives that end in ER. So for adverbs that end in an ER, the adjectives that end in ER becoming a superlative adverb, we're going to add, instead of isime, it's reme. If you remember, it was remus aum for those special adjectives. Well, here it's reme. All right, let's look at this practically speaking here. Here's an example of longe, an adverb in the positive form, meaning far. To long, the stem, we add an ius, and that gives us longius. This is more far, or rather far, or even too far. And the superlative, we add isime to long, and we end up longissime, most far, or maybe even very far. Now, I wanted to compare this real quickly to our adjective, longusaum, the comparative. Notice in the neuter comparative, it's longius. The adjective, the adverb here is also longius. So context will tell you, does this mean more far, or does this mean more long? That's going to be context that tells you that, but the form is exactly the same. And again, you can see by comparison, the superlative was longissimus aum compared to the superlative adverb form, longissime. All right, let's look at a couple more examples here. Here is pulcher, and it becomes pulcre as an adjective, as an adverb in the positive form, beautifully. We take that stem, pulcre, and we add ius, so we end with pulchrius, more beautifully, or rather beautifully, or too beautifully. And again, because this ends in er instead of isime, we add reme, so it's pulchereme. Now, you may remember that for the superlatives, one unique thing about superlatives for adjectives that end in er is that masculine er form comes out in the superlative, and so that's going to happen here as well in the adverbial form. So instead of pulchreme, it's pulchereme, most beautifully or very beautifully. Another example here, acreter, from acer, acris, acre. This word means fiercely, acreter, as an adverb. Remember, we took the stem acr and added an iter, so it's acreter. And we're going to take that same stem acr and add an ius, so it's acrius, more fiercely, or rather, or too fiercely. And again, we're going to take the acer, again the masculine form of that adjective, and add a reme, so it's acereme, most fiercely or very fiercely. And then one final example here, sapienter. We took the sapiens, sapientis, and we added an er to the base, sapient, so we end up with sapienter, wisely. And we take that stem and add an ius, so it's sapientius, more wisely, or rather, or too wisely. And then finally, sapientissime. Again, we add the issime for most adverbs in the superlative form, most wisely, or very wisely. All right. Now, keep in mind that there are some adverbs that do not fit into these categories, or they break the rules. And just as we had some comparative and superlative adjectives that are completely unique and you had to memorize those forms, so too we have some unique forms of adverbs in the comparative and superlative, or even unique in how they form in the positive degree. They don't form according to the standard from the adjective that we just learned. It doesn't form according to the standard. So there are some that are unique, but these are the predominant rules that you need to keep in mind. Now, we also talked about qualm with comparatives as well as superlatives with adjectives. We also can have qualm with comparatives in adverbs as well. Let's remind us of the translation of this. When qualm follows a comparative degree adverb, it functions as a coordinating conjunction, meaning than, and it's going to link the two items that are being compared. Here's an example. Hic puer celerius cacere quam ille. We have the comparative adverb here, celerius, from celere, meaning quickly, and then here's the conjunction quam. And so our translation here is hic puer, this boy, cacurit, ran, celerius, more quickly, quam, than, ille, that one. This boy ran more quickly than that one. So this is a use of quam with the comparative adverb. Now we can also have quam with a superlative adverb. Reminder here of what that looks like. When quam precedes a superlative degree adverb, it functions adverbially and indicates that the person or thing being modified has the greatest possible degree of a particular quality. And when we translate it, we're going to translate it as blankly as possible. Let's look at an example here. Hic puer cacurit quam celerissime. And here we have the superlative adverb celerissime, and here's our conjunction quam. Translation would be hic puer, this boy, cacurit, ran, quam celerissime, as quickly as possible. All right, so just like our superlative, quam with superlatives and the adjectives, it's the same with the adverbs. All right, so if you need to do a little review on the adverbs, take the time to do it. I'll press on right now to the next part of chapter 32, irregular verbs. Now, here's a list of irregular verbs that we have either learned thus far or we are learning in this chapter. The last one, we'll be learning in subsequent chapters. But this is a list of very common irregular verbs. Sum esse, to be, possum, posse, to be able. We learned those very early on in our studies. The last couple of chapters, we learned fero, feri, to bring or to bear. And in this chapter, we're learning three new irregular verbs. Wolo, wele, to want or wish. Nōlō, nōlē, to not want or wish. Mālō, male, to prefer. And then we'll learn iri, to go, and I guess probably the next chapter too. But I just wanted to include it on the list here. Now, here's a reminder of sum esse, fui, futurum, the to be verb, irregular. You remember this. It's sum esse est, sumus estis sunt. Now, even though we actually call this an irregular verb, there's actually a pattern here. You can see in the first person singular and the first person plural and the third person plural, you actually have the ending plus su. And that's distinguished from second singular, third singular, and second plural that basically are endings plus s. And so you can actually see a pattern. I'm pointing this out now because this pattern is going to be prevalent in the three new irregular verbs we're about to learn, Wolo, Nōlō, and Mālō. So look at that pattern there. First singular plural, third plural. Those are all part of one grouping, and then second and third singular and second plural is a part of another grouping. And what you basically have here again is SU plus the endings, or ES plus endings. That's basically the pattern here. There's our endings. I just want to animate this here for you. There you go. So you end up with sum s. That es is going to contract into just ses. But that's the pattern we've got there. So sum es est, sumus estis sunt. Your endings are exactly what you'd expect them to be. Your present tense, regular present tense endings. Mst, mustis, nt. but it's just adding the either SU prefix or an ES prefix in front of it. So keep that pattern in mind, and let's press on to the new set of irregular verbs. Here we have Wolo, Wele, Woloi. And if you notice, there's no fourth principal part. As a consequence of that, there are no passive forms of this irregular verb, because without participial form, we can't have any passive forms. This verb means to want or to wish. We get words like volunteer, volition. Those are English derivatives from this Latin verb. Now, here is the pattern that I want us to look at. Remember a minute ago, we said first singular, first plural, third plural form one category, second and third singular, second plural form another category, and we see that here. We have Wolo, so it's VOL plus ending in first singular. For first plural, it's VOLU. You got to just keep that U in mind there. It's a little irregular still there. But VOLUMUS, and then VOLUNT. So those form one category, which is quite different than the second and third singular and second plural. Here you have wis and wolt and woltis. So these forms are completely irregular, but there is a pattern here. And if you memorize this pattern, it will help you to be able to keep this in mind as you're conjugating it, and certainly as you're translating it in actual context of sentences and paragraphs and stories. So Wolo, wis, wolt, wolomus, woltis, wolunt. So again, look at that pattern and just kind of memorize that. Now, next verb, nolo, nole, noloi. What's interesting about this verb is it's actually a contraction. It's wolo, the word you just learned, to want or to wish, plus a negation, either ne or non. And when you contract those together, you're going to end up with nolo. So nota bene, if we take wolo, any of those forms that start with a VOL, first singular and first plural and third plural, then what's going to happen, it's going to contract with the non to form one word. It's going to look like this, nolo, or nolamus, or nolunt. Those are the forms. We'll look at a chart here where you can see them all together, but notice this is a contraction of non plus wolo in all three of these forms. First singular, first plural, third plural. This means, by the way, to not want. This is a contraction of wolo, so not to want, but to not want or to not wish. Now, by comparison, let's look at the other three forms of this in the present tense. If we take ne or non, we're going to add it to wis or wolt or woltis. And here's a nota bene. If it doesn't start, so the three forms of wolo that don't start with a VOL, this is not going to contract with non. It's simply going to form two new words. So we're going to end up with non-wis and non-wolt and non-woltis. Let's look at the chart all together here. Here's all forms. So technically this is what you've got. Non plus wolo, non plus wis, non plus wolt, non-wolomus, non-woltis, non-wolunt. But three of these forms, the one in green here, are going to contract together. If it begins with the VOL, remember, we're going to contract and we end up with nolo, non-wis, non-wolt, nolamus, non-woltis, nolunt. So these are the forms of nolo. And again, you just have to memorize these irregularities. But again, if you look at the pattern, first singular plural, third plural, those are all contracted completely together versus second and third singular, second plural, where they're two different words adding non to the forms that are already there. Now let's look at the next irregular verb, mālō, male, māloi. Again, no fourth principal part, so no passive. This is actually a contraction of wolo plus the adjective magis, which means more. And when you add those together, it means I want more. And it ultimately can mean I want more or I prefer, which is often the translation. So nota bene, if it starts with VOL, so any of the forms of the word wolo that start with the VOL, it's going to contract with magis, which, by the way, is going to contract down to just a ma with a long mark, a macron over that A. So you end up with Mālō. It's going to completely contract together. And this means, again, as I said, to want more or to prefer. Now, the three forms, first singular plural, third plural, all going to form that way. But for the other three that are part of this pattern, nota bene, if it's not starting with the vol, V-O-L, second and third singular, second plural, then we're just simply going to stick the contracted ma to the beginning of this word, and it's not going to actually contract together with it. And so you're going to end up with mawis. Let's look at this in a chart to see what this looks like. So here it should be technically magis plus all of these forms of wolo. But if you remember the pattern, the three that are in green here are going to completely contract with magis. The other three in the purple here are going to simply add the ma to the front of these words. So here's what it's going to look like. We're going to end up with Mālō, mawis, mawult, Mālomus, mawultis, malunt. So again, the VOL in the green forms have completely contracted or merged into the magis, leaving us Mālō, Mālomus, malunt. The other three, the wis, wolt, woltis, we didn't lose those forms of wolo. We just added in front of it a prefix of the contracted form of magis, of ma. So we end up with mawis, mawult, mawultis. All right, so again, irregular, but a pattern. All right, now let's look at how we conjugate these irregular verbs. If you notice, it's only in the present tense that we have irregularities. Again, wolo, wis, wolt, wolomus, woltis, wolunt. But for the imperfect and future, it's exactly what you'd expect. The VOL, abam, wolabam, wolabas, wolabat, wolabamus, wolabatis, wolabant. For the future, the stereotypical first person singular connecting vowel plus present endings. These are basically third conjugation verbs here, irregular third conjugation. So you end up with wolam, woles, wolet, wolemus, woletis, wolent. There we go. For the perfect indicative, active, you're going to end up using third principal part plus your endings, isti, it, etc. For pluperfect, arama, rasarat, etc. And future perfect, aro, aris, arit. So those are all pretty standard. There's nothing out of the ordinary, extraordinary about how you conjugate these verbs. It's only in the present tense. For the subjunctive mood, we're going to take the this is going to be based off of our study of ferro, fere. It's going to be similar pattern here, but we're going to take the VEL, VELIM. Remember your sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint, that kind of pattern. So here it's velim, velis, velet, velimus, veletis, velent. And for the imperfect, we're going to take the infinitive wele and add the MST into it, onto the end of it. So it's welem, weles, welet, welemus, weletis, welent. No future, of course. All right. And of course, the perfect form, it's VOLU, the third principal part, minus the ending. So wolu plus your erim, eris, erit, etc. And for the pluperfect, again, the third principal part, stem, wolu, plus isem, isem, isses, isset, issemus, issetis, isset, no future perfect. So that's how you conjugate wolo. For nolo, again, keep in mind it's only in the present tense that we have any kind of irregularities. Nolo, non wis, non wolt, no lumus, non woltis, no lunt. And again, the imperfect and future, exactly what you'd expect. The NOL plus bam, nolabam, nolabas, nolabat, etc. For future, nolam, noles, nolet, etc. For the perfect tense indicative, again, third principal part, nolu plus your ist, it endings, pluperfect, nolu plus arama, rasarat endings, and pluperfect, nolu plus your aro, aris, arit. Not out of the ordinary. Subjunctive, again, nolim, nolis, nolit, nolimus, nolitis, nolent. And then the imperfect subjunctive, take the infinitive, nole plus your endings. And then finally your subjunctive perfect nolu, your third principal part, plus erem, eres, eret. There we go. And then the third principal part plus isem, ises, iset. All right, and then finally malo. Again, the irregularities, I can't say that, irregularities only in the present tense. Malo, malwis, malwit, malwolt, malumus, excuse me, I can't talk, malumus, malwoltus, and malunt. And then malabam, malabas, malabat. And then malam, males, malet. For the perfect indicative, again, third principal part, stem malu plus your endings. And then pluperfect, same thing with your aram, arasarat endings, and future perfect with your aro, aris, arit. And then finally, in your subjunctive, malim, maleth, malis, malit, malimus, malitus, malint. And then the imperfect, your infinitive, male plus endings. And then quite lastly, the perfect system of the subjunctive, third principal part, stem, malu plus aram, aris, arit. And then your malu plus isem, ises, iset. All right, so that's how you form the, or I should say conjugate these irregulars. Here's how you form the imperatives for the irregulars. I went ahead and included fero, feri, tuli, latum, just because I just wanted to include it as part of the group here because we did study it a chapter or two ago, and I don't think I included that in the video. But the imperative singular is just fair. We drop the re infinitive ending, so it gives you fair. That's the typical rule that we've had before. And then we add a te for plural. Now, for Wolo and Mālō, there is no imperative forms at all. We do have Nōlō. Nole has Noli. We're going to drop the le at the end and add a long I, so it's Noli. And then to that we add the typical te, nolite, for a command to more than one person. Now, Nōlō, Nole, the imperatives Noli, nolite are actually used for negative commands. They will be matched up with complementary infinitives. And so, I do not wish you, I do not want you to remain, I do not want you to eat or to run or to surrender. So you'll see this often in a negative command with a complementary infinitive. Now, the last thing we're going to study for this chapter is one more use of the subjunctive. Here's a quick review of the uses of the subjunctive that we've studied thus far. If you remember, we studied the jussive, the purpose clauses, result clauses, indirect questions, and then finally last chapter we looked at cum clauses. In this chapter, we're going to be studying proviso clauses. And as you can see, we're now over halfway done through our list of subjunctive uses. We're going to move through them pretty quickly here. So here are proviso clauses. They're pretty simple to recognize and to understand. A proviso clause is a subordinate clause with a subjunctive verb that is introduced by the conjunction de modo, which means provided that or so long as. And in other words, it doesn't have to be de modo, but you'll see it a lot. It can be any other word that expresses a provisional circumstance. And ne will be used as the negative in these clauses. How do you recognize it? Well, you're going to see a subjunctive verb in the secondary clause introduced by de modo. It's pretty simple. It could also, again, be another similar kind of word that expresses provisional circumstance. How do you translate it? Well, as we've seen with most of our subjunctives, you're going to simply translate it as indicative. Let's look at two quick examples here. Here we have non temebo de modo hic Romanias. Non temebo, I will not be afraid. De modo, notice de modo is introducing a secondary clause, and you look at Romanias, that is a subjunctive verb, active present tense, second person singular. I will not be afraid, provided that you remain here. Romanias is you remain, hic is here, and de modo is provided that. So I will not be afraid, provided that you remain here. So it's a proviso clause. You have a secondary clause with a subjunctive verb introduced by de modo. It's pretty simple. How about a negative proviso clause? Here we have eremus felices de modo ne discedas. We have de modo in the secondary clause with a discedas subjunctive verb. So we have eremus felices, we shall be happy. De modo, provided that, discedas, you leave, but we've got the negation here. You do not leave. We shall be happy provided that you do not leave. So again, these proviso clauses are pretty simple to recognize. De modo, a secondary clause, a subordinate clause with a subjunctive verb, and translated as indicative. All right, don't forget to study the vocabulary. We will have a quiz later this week.